And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happenstance to hopefully meander into this very important conversation based on a relationship. And then, of course, us getting this message out to the public as broadly as possible. But it is my great honor to introduce somebody that I've had an incredible good fortune to work with and interview in the past, but his findings are more relevant than ever. His name is Art Wilmart, and he is the professor emeritus at George Washington University. And I'm going to just read directly off of his bio page from George Washington's website, just to give you a sense of the broad scope of what Mr. Wilmart brings to the conversation. And we're going to be discussing Taming the Megabanks, a book that he authored and released in 2020 with a couple of sequel papers that will be able to fully realize what we're dealing with the constant question that I've been asking, and I have to get to the broader public of understanding what exactly is reality as it relates to our financial system. Arthur Wilmarth joined the faculty at George Washington in 1986 after 11 years in private practice. Prior to joining George Washington's law faculty, he was partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Jones Day. During his 34 years as a member of the faculty, Professor Wilmarth taught courses in banking, law, contracts, corporations, professional responsibility, and American constitutional history. He served as executive director of the Center of Law and Economics and Finance from 2011 to 2014. He is the author, as I mentioned, of Taming the Megabanks, Why We Need a New Glass-Steagall Act. And I'll put the link in the description down below. He's also the co-editor of Panic of 2008, The Causes, the Consequences, and Implications for Reform. He has published more than 40 law review articles and book chapters in the fields of financial regulation and American constitutional history. In 2005, the American College of Consumer Financial Services Lawyers awarded him its prize for the best law review article published in the field of consumer financial services law during the previous year. Professor Wilmarth has testified before the committees of the U.S. Congress, the California Legislature, and the D.C. Council on Financial Regulatory Issues. In 2010, he was a consultant of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, the body established by Congress to report the causes of the financial crisis of 2007 through 2009. During 2008 through 2009, he served as chair of the section on financial institutions and consumer financial services of the Association of American Law Schools, after serving as the section's chair-elect and annual program chair during 2007 through 2008. Professor Wilmarth is a member of the International Advisory Board of the Journal of Banking Regulation, published by Palgrave Macmillan, and he is also a member of the Advisory Board to the American Antitrust Institute. Professor Wilmarth was a member of GW's faculty for 16 years, and he served as chair of the Faculty Senate Executive Committee in 2004, 2005, and 2008 and 2009. And he was a longtime member of the Faculty Senate Committee on Professional Ethics and Academic Freedom and chaired that committee for several years. He received the Trachtenberg, if I pronounce Trachtenberg, Prize for the University Services in 2005. So it goes without saying that Professor Wilmarth is one of the country's leading experts in being able to provide answers to these incredible questions that we continue to have to ask because the problem continues to proliferate. And so without further ado, with that long-winded ramp up, but I think it's important, Mr. Wilmarth, because you also are, I don't know if you're a member, I know you are a self-proclaimed Republican, and I think that's important to mention in context to, well, I think it was just revealed and trending on, of course, Elon Musk's wonderful truth platform, of course, that the Civil War is indeed happening this morning. And one of my shortcuts, Professor Wilmarth, is that corruption fuels and it births and fuels fascism. And I know that we might not see everything ideologically on the same premise, but we believe in the integrity of the law above everything else. And so here I am in a situation in 2024, which I can't believe we are, that we're still having to deal with the incredible details that you've already provided us. So let's just start with Glass-Steagall. Can you explain to me what the impetus was first, if you could just give us a quick overview of Glass-Steagall initially, but why you felt compelled and why you had to bring these revolutions to light to create a new Glass-Steagall.
Yeah, so the Glass-Steagall Act was passed in 1933, really at the very depth of the Great Depression, in response to the tremendous crash of the banking system and the financial markets that occurred, particularly in 1932 and 1933, but had begun in 1929 with the crash, the great crash of October 1929 in Wall Street. And interestingly, the supporters of Glass-Steagall included a number of prominent Republicans, primarily from the Midwest, who were, I guess you could say, partly, broadly part of the trust-busting progressive tradition of opposing concentrations of financial power, particularly on Wall Street, but in other financial centers of the country as well, and who broadly supported what I would call, true financial markets that were not controlled by small elites, fair competition, against financial manipulations of different types. So and in fact, Ferdinand Pecora, who was the chief counsel of the Senate committee that led the investigation of Wall Street frauds and Wall Street manipulations during the 1920s, came out of that Republican tradition. So what the Pecora committee found was that Wall Street had engaged in a massive series of frauds and manipulations that had devastated American investors during the 1920s. They had deliberately pumped up stocks and bonds for highly speculative and highly risky, both domestic and foreign corporations, and particularly foreign governments. And people bought these very speculative stocks and bonds based upon the reputations of the Wall Street firms and major firms in Chicago as well, because the feeling was, well, these were highly reputable financial firms, and they wouldn't be selling essentially fraudulent stuff to American investors. In many ways, this group of large Wall Street and Chicago firms was aided and abetted by government policies during the 1920s. Interestingly, against the advice of Herbert Hoover, who was constantly warning about the dangers of speculation on Wall Street. And of course, then the entire edifice collapsed in the winter of 1932 and 33, at which point Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, and in many ways, Glass-Steagall was a carryover from efforts started, by the Senate, during the prior administration, and of course, then it became joined to the Securities Act of 1933, which essentially was a Truth and Securities Act borrowed from the British that essentially was an effort to stop people from lying about the securities they were selling to the public. So the Securities Act.
Can I answer something just real quick to that?
Sure.
So, I mean, and this took me a while to understand. I've had the great fortune of working with Michael Perino, the author of Ferdinand Pecora.
Right, who wrote a great book about Pecora, right.
Right, and what was so amazing, as I journeyed through this process, but I always knew it intuitively, but I didn't know the actual legal construct and the structure of the entirety of the markets, particularly in the capital markets. But as we, as sort of a spectral, if you will, the notion of when you say lying, it's deceptive acts and practices that it is this monumental sort of effort, of course, in pursuit of a lot of upside profits. But just really quickly, as it relates to Ferdinand Pecora, which was the miracle of this time period, he wasn't an expert in all things finance.
No, he was a very good prosecutor, essentially. Right.
he went and got the facts at a time where they didn't
Right.
have computers and huge resources, but he figured out the games. Can you kind of pick up with that sort of unbelievable commit from?
Right. So, I mean, Pecora was a very gifted prosecutor. He had pursued a number of corruption cases, some involving, sort of small level broker, pump and dump schemes, but more government corruption cases. But so he was a very skilled prosecutor and especially cross examiner. So essentially, when the Senate gave him the lead of the investigation in essentially January 1933, the investigation had been ongoing, but they hadn't had a very effective prosecutor to lead it. When they gave him the lead, they enabled him under power of subpoena to bring in, essentially the leading Wall Street chieftains of the time. And so Wall Street was dominated by a small group of what we would now think of as investment banks or securities firms. And J.P. Morgan was and Kuhn Loeb were the paradigmatic firms in that category, and some very large commercial banks, including National City Bank, which was the predecessor of what is now Citigroup, what was then Bank of America, some other large commercial banks, Continental Illinois, and they had sort of muscled their way into the securities business in the 1920s, again, with the tacit permission of the federal regulators and to some degree of Congress. So you had these commercial banks and investment banks, and sort of competing very aggressively to get as many of these securities offerings as they could all over the world, not just in the United States, but in Europe and Latin America and Asia, all over the place, and then bring these offerings back to New York and market them across the country to people of ordinary means, school teachers, small business people. They had sold war bonds during World War I that were very popular and very well accepted, and of course they paid off. So their success in selling war bonds sort of, in a sense, prepared the population for, well, gee, if they sold you good war bonds, why wouldn't they sell you good corporate bonds or foreign government bonds? Or, of course, this was a period of rapid technological progress, radios, airplanes, other, kitchen appliances. So people were buying up the stocks of these companies that were selling these new technological marvels as well. What Pecora did was bring these people before his committee and essentially unmask what they were doing. So he would bring them and these chieftains in and say, well, let's look at the prospectuses that you were offering to the public, and yet your own people were telling you essentially how dangerous and how speculative these stocks and bonds were, and you sold them anyway. Essentially, what Wall Street was doing was essentially uncovered. And if you look at the newspapers at the time, the newspapers covered it very actively and with great excitement. So every morning you'd get front page news saying, "Oh, here's what Pecora, got the Wall Street chieftains to tell him." J.P. Morgan, for example, was giving. They had what was called a preferred list, where they would send to the political leaders, major personalities, their corporate customers. They would tell them, "Hey, you can get in on the latest stock offering, and we'll give you a big discount." And then, of course, you can sell it immediately if you want to and cash in on the difference between the discount and the offering price. And literally hundreds of very prominent people were getting these preferred discounts. And essentially, J.P. Morgan was building up this network of tremendous professional political support. Many, both the heads of the Democratic National Committee and the head of the Republican National Committee were on that preferred list.
Sounds
Uh,
familiar. It sounds like nothing's ever changed from that time period. But
yeah,
also,
people like Charles Lindbergh and John Pershing, Black Jack Pershing were on the list. I'm
you know,
sorry.
no, I mean it's brilliant though from the standpoint that I mean what I said was like Mark Twain says, maybe history doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And as you're kind of
Right,
providing this litany, I mean, first and foremost, we can't describe this without the understanding that there was 25% unemployment. We were in the throes of the
right,
Great
right.
Depression. There was literally,
Millions of people lost their homes. Hoovervilles. Right.
yeah, in the center of Manhattan, no less, right? And I
Yeah,
mean,
there's a Hooverville in Central Park. Right,
right.
right,
So here comes the press is doing the job, and you've got the salacious activity of these, what Bill Black would call high flyers, but like Sunshine Charlie Mitchell and some of the other
right. He was the head of National City Bank. Right,
right and
and right, and you had the head of the Insol, who was the head of the largest public utility empire centered in Chicago, was selling stocks through a major Chicago stockbroker, basically saying if the light's on, you're earning money, and so they sold huge amounts of Insol bonds, particularly to their own Chicago utility customers, and then the Insol utility empire was tremendously leveraged and collapsed in 1932, which was a tremendous shock to the Chicago whole area. It's triggered a bank panic in Chicago in the summer of 1932 because many of the Chicago banks were involved with it, and then obviously cratered any again, further trust. The stock market had a couple of tentative recoveries in 1930 and 31, but the collapse of these big empires, sort of shattered that trust. So and again, they had sold the American public on the fact that you can trust us, right? We wouldn't steer you wrong. I mean, you can read the magazine advertisements the National City put out saying, hey, if you can't invest money on your own, you need a trusted advisor. We're your advisor. We would never sell you something that we didn't think was suitable for you. And of course, what Pecora uncovered was that despite those blandishments and promises, in fact, they were selling stocks and bonds that they knew were at the best highly speculative and at the worst doomed to fail. I mean that within a very short time the borrower would be unable to pay the debt service, let alone the principal.
it reminds
So
me.
what happened? What Glass-Steagall did was to say, first of all, the Securities Act of 1933 said you have to stop lying when you sell securities. You have to disclose all the material facts about the securities, and you have to do it truthfully. What the Glass-Steagall Act said is the combination of commercial banking and securities offerings and securities trading is inherently pernicious and destructive because the bank is inevitably tempted to use its deposits to promote highly speculative ventures, including making unsound loans to the companies to which they're selling their securities. And the bank cannot be an objective, disinterested advisor to its customers, because banks for many years had operated trust departments, obviously, where they did advise their trust customers about investments. And what the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act said is, we know that banks cannot give objective, disinterested investment advice. They will be always tempted to promote what they're selling, and they're going to mislead their customers. And then
Can I insert a
yeah,
couple of things? I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but
sure.
because I think it's so incredibly important for the viewers and everybody that I'm dealing with in all of these different ramifications of bringing this further and further to light. What we discovered and what I learned from Michael Perino and what you're telling us, in addition, is that a lot of these tactics included, and I can't believe how Pecora figured this out without the resources, the little resources and time that he had, and especially no technology. But there was front running, there was insider trading, there was
Right.
racketeering. There was all sorts
this preferred list was really a form of front running because you give discounts to people before the offering starts, right? They can get in on the front end at a discount and then dump their stock as soon as the offering starts.
right. And so you ended up with situations in the press where you saw these celebrities of a sort, these rich and powerful titans, and you find out you learn their actual dirty secrets and their tricks. and
Right.
people are in soup lines, right? And then they had the revelation that people like Sunshine, Charlie Mitchell wasn't paying his taxes, and
Right.
everybody.
Right.
So there was a character flaw. So as you unpack all of these things, you learn literally, and this is what was amazing to me because
He basically did a wash sale to his wife,
yeah,
so that he could avoid taxes by doing a wash sale to his wife. Uh, after the market crash, that would wipe out his bonuses. But of course, he would of course always intend to make his wife whole. I mean, the wash sales were a sham.
yeah,
Uh,
it's inside collusion playing with asymmetric information and all of these things that I learned later because I wasn't taught this in college. It wasn't part of my
right.
curriculum. It
Well,
wasn't
then
part
there
of
was
my
a guy even worse named Albert Wiggin, who was the leader of Chase National Bank, which is, of course, one of the forerunners of J.P. Morgan Chase. So Chase and National City were the two big commercial bank competitors. Wiggin even sold his bank stock short as the stock market was collapsing in 1929. At least Mitchell didn't do that. I mean, Wiggin actually sold the stock short and made big profits as bank stock was going down. I mean, the guy had no, basically the morality of I don't know what you want to call it, a cobra, essentially. That again, on the upside, I take all the upside, and then on the downside, I screw the people who don't realize that I'm selling my own stock short.
Somewhere between a shell game or a rigged casino and very much mafia like, right? So the American people have this incredible bootstrap Italian immigrant who happened to really have a lot of great sort of instincts
Right.
because he understood scams, but he wasn't an expert
Right.
in all of these things. But the point that I'm trying to echo what you're telling us to the audience, if they're like, okay, this is ancient history. No, everything that we're talking about repeated in a very similar sort of fashion what created the 2008 great financial crisis.
Right.
That
See, the
ultimately,
third lesson that they drew was that if you allow your securities markets to be combined with the banks, you will inevitably create boom and bust cycles, and you will destabilize the banking system. So the banks will be no more strong or resilient than the securities market at the moment. So they will boom, during a stock market boom and make lots of money. But when the stock market turns, it'll drag down the entire banking system. And people forget that the way in which Roosevelt kind of rescued the banking system after the so-called bank holiday of March 1933 was essentially to have the Federal Reserve more or less guarantee the deposits of the banks that were reopened, that were not closed and didn't stay closed. And then the Reconstruction Finance Corporation bought preferred stock in many of those banks and recapitalized them. So there was, in a sense, a massive bailout of the banking system that survived 1933. But they understood that these bailouts would be repeated, would have to be done again if you allowed the banking system to be essentially yoked to the securities markets. And so after the Glass-Steagall Act was passed, we essentially, we had no similar banking crises from the 1930s until arguably the late 1980s. And even that crisis was, although severe, was nothing like the Great Depression. And as you say, it wasn't until the barriers between banking and securities were taken down again, which happened over a period of a dozen years between 1987 and the final repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999, as those barriers were taken down and as banks were allowed to recombine with securities firms, then you created the same, as you say, financial casino that had existed in the 1920s. And as you say, within 10 years after Glass-Steagall being taken down, we had a second boom and crash that was, I think, arguably at least as severe as what happened in 1932, 33.
at least to a majority of Americans, but not the people that were on the inside that got bailed out.
Yes, because what we had was essentially a more comprehensive and a quicker bailout in 2008 and 2009. What happened in the Great Depression was that you had a series of crises and collapses between 1929 and 1933 that essentially collapsed the whole financial system. What happened in 2008 and 9 was the government, to prevent that from happening, rushed in with a much quicker series of bailouts and support measures that mitigated the crash. Didn't crash the entire financial system, as you say. Still ended up, with 8.5 million people losing their jobs and more than 10 million people losing their homes. But the public didn't experience the full brunt of the crash in the way that they did in 1933. And in a way, I think that prevented a full reckoning, a full accounting for what the new casino banks had done.
Before we move on to the next stage of this, let me just recalibrate and see if I can again kind of reiterate some of what you've said to bridge to where we're going here, because the lessons that we learned from a massive top-down, what we would call in modern parlance, modern executive compensation, asymmetric information, the top people having all of the information about all of the different ways. You've got to think of it like, if you can't understand financialization and all of the different terms, you got to think of it like maybe a shell game. There's a lot of different pieces of the puzzle moving around at different times, but the guys up top with the incentive can create a scenario.
Because their compensation was mainly upfront bonuses, and the bonuses were based essentially on both profits and the kinds of fees they were making through all these stock offerings. So everything was front loaded. You get your bonus up front. As you say, there was no clawback. In other words, when the bottom fell out, there was no clawback with the bonuses. In fact, National City even paid some of the bonuses while the market was still collapsing. They still paid the bonuses. So it was completely front loaded, and as you say, asymmetric. That they captured all the upside and suffered none of the downside.
But because the key consideration here of all of it, though, and this is what the American people have to understand, is that, and it was described to me by former New York AG. His name will come to me. He's a very famous guy. Got himself in a lot.
Elliot Spitzer, probably.
Elliot Spitzer, but what he always talked about was OPP, other people's money, right? And so when you put
which was Brandeis's original concept in 1913. If you go back to Brandeis's famous book. Other people's money. That was he was predicting what was going to happen on Wall Street 16 years ahead of what actually happened. I mean, he was already saying in 1913 we've got to split up banks and the securities markets. We can't have this combination.
So Franklin Delano Roosevelt is frequently cited as the guy who said, "I saved capitalism from itself," and he did so with his transition initially because of the Pecora investigation. And it goes on into Keynesian economics and so forth. But ultimately, the idea was to reveal through a press that actually had skin in the game for the American people, because it was at that time, I would say or suggest the fourth estate. We had muckrakers beforehand. We had this massive, pain and suffering, and the press was working for people probably paying a dime for the news, as opposed to mega corporations that own.
FDR understood Wall Street very well, because he had many of his closest friends and classmates from Harvard were on Wall Street. I mean, he understood Wall Street very well, and therefore totally distrusted it, and was considered an enemy to his class.
Right, and he said that in Madison Square Garden in a famous 1936 speech that preceded a lot of this stuff. But the point that I want to make before we go into the next phase is to remind people what we're talking about is Professor Wilmart's prescient work in taming the mega banks. We're in 2024, my friends. This is not 1933. But what happened in 1933 were all the lessons that we relived because we created a deregulatory scenario in the late 90s that would lead to this mammoth, decades-long march to what we're about to get into next. But what people need to understand, especially in this complex, confusing, ridiculously overwhelming political scenario that we're currently in, is that the government, if you want to think about this as a government of, by, and for the people, we've got plenty of capacity and capable people like Professor Wilmarth and other initiatives that if they had the political will, it would force a reckoning. And that's what we're talking about by way of taming the mega banks, because it takes legislation and experts in the system to prevent all of us being hoodwinked because they know how the game is played. So on that transition note, can you now kind of dovetail into, the necessity to make the case for a new Glass-Steagall Act through taming the banks off the heels of the great financial crisis, and then we'll get into everything.
So essentially, when the banks were allowed to get back into the securities markets, and again, as I say, that was a series of regulatory loopholes, and then finally the repeal of Glass-Steagall between 1987 and 1999, the banks quickly reverted to the same structures and the same behaviors that they had exhibited during the 1920s. So effectively, you have the big banks setting up or acquiring securities firms. The largest securities firms of the time, the so-called Big Five, they acquired thrift institutions and industrial banks. They couldn't own regular banks, but they could own these depository institutions. So they were kind of sort of sneaking into the banking business on their own part. And then you had these huge financial conglomerates, along with some big European so-called universal banks that were already into the securities business. They became, what I call the Big 17, essentially 9 American institutions and 8 European institutions. They became the big peddlers of the subprime financial boom. So you had tremendous booms, obviously, as you know, in the home mortgage area, but also in the commercial mortgage area and in the corporate leverage loan area. So the idea was that you take very risky loans, you package them up into so-called mortgage-backed or asset-backed securities. You then slice those securities into so-called tranches, and you use the credit agencies, which of course you've paid off very well, to verify that the top 80% of the tranches are essentially AAA, which are supposed to be, as default proof. There's no chance of default.
That's why they can sell it to pensions and to sovereign government.
They can sell it to pensions and life insurance companies, right? Anybody who needed to only invest in AAA stuff. And then the so-called mezzanine bit, which was usually about 15 to 17%, which were normally in the lowest levels of so-called investment grade securities, they actually had trouble selling those because a lot of people thought that they didn't get a high enough yield to justify the risk. So then they created something called collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs, which became dumping grounds for these mezzanine tranches. But then they would transfer the mezzanine tranches of the mortgage-backed securities to the CDOs. They would retranche the CDOs and sell the top 80% of those as AAA. Essentially, the ones they couldn't sell, they either absorbed onto their own balance sheets, or they sold them to hedge funds and lent money to the hedge funds to finance the purchases. So effectively, they were creating this infernal machine where they were creating very risky loans, equally risky securities. Those that they couldn't sell to investors, they either took onto their own balance sheets or pushed them off to hedge funds, but they were exposed to risk because essentially they were financing the hedge funds. So you had two things happening.
Now for one thing real quick, I'm so sorry, because your language is professional. Of course, yours is
right.
A bit as it gets, but people who know our work through the con understand that there was what we call vintage time periods where the process of liar's loans, loans that were so extraordinary.
Right. No income, no assets, no job. Right. Right. Or the so-called fog the mirror loans. If the guy could fog the mirror, you made him a loan. Right.
And you sat on the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission as both a consultant, but I mean, you guys were in the thick of revealing, because I've read the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission's that was pretty much the skeleton of which I was following, but it was like the percentage of liar's loans between 2004 and 2006 were extraordinary.
Yeah, skyrocketed. Yeah.
And so, I mean, what we're talking
And the
about is,
regulators saw it happening and did nothing to stop it.
so it's all built
By
on a healthy farm.
2005, the regulators knew by 2005 that this was out of control. And there's a very interesting episode where Lawrence Lindsay, who was a former member of the Federal Reserve Board and who also served as an economic advisor to President G.W. Bush, but was no longer employed there. He went back to the White House in 2006, and he told them, look, this housing market is completely out of control. You're making too many, they're making millions of loans to people who will never be able to repay them. The loans will only pay off as long as housing prices keep rising, because then you can either refinance the loan or sell the house. But once housing prices level off or start falling, the whole market's going to implode, and the banks are going to be dragged down with it because they're exposed to this. And the response was, we're not worried, and it's under control. And then one person told him, well, don't you know it's the only engine still running the economy? We can't stop it. It's the only engine that is still creating economic growth. So, I mean, that episode, again, means that people had either blinders on or sort of the notion of eyes wide shut, right? They knew exactly what was happening, but they basically said, we can't stop this infernal cycle. So what you had is millions of people put into loans that they couldn't possibly repay. They'd be far better off renting than going into a loan that you can't repay, and you're going to lose everything. You're going to destroy your credit history. You're going to lose probably most of your possessions. So millions of people being put into homes they couldn't afford. Millions of investors buying securities that were going to default, that were going to wreak havoc on their investment portfolios. And then all of our major banks and securities firms taking on enormous risks that you're now wrapped up in an entire Ponzi scheme. Essentially, a Ponzi scheme is that it only goes on as long as the prices keep rising, because then people can either cash out by selling or refinance into a new equally risky loan. But once housing prices stopped rising and started to fall, which they did in the second half of 2006, the whole thing is going to unravel, which is exactly what happened. So between the second half of 2006 and the fall of 2007, you have the air is starting to come out of the balloon, and people are realizing it, and people are beginning to panic, and everybody's starting to pull in their horns. And then everybody who's exposed, either the homeowners, the investors, or the banks and securities firms, are going to come completely unstuck, which in a way is a complete repeat of what happened, beginning with the stock market crash of 1929. As people lost all that paper wealth, then they begin pulling back their horns, loans start defaulting, companies start laying off people, no more securities being sold. It was so what happened in 2006 through 2008 was in many ways a repeat of what happened between 1929 and 1931. Now the difference comes that when the panic really started, which was when they did not bail out Lehman Brothers, they bailed out Bear Stearns by essentially selling it to J.P. Morgan Chase. But they didn't bail out Lehman Brothers, then the entire market panics. And then you were looking at something like what the country was looking at in March of 1933. The entire financial system could collapse.
Let me insert this real quick, though, because it was truly global. It was,
right. The same thing was happening in Europe, because they were Spain, Ireland, other Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, they were all having similar real estate booms, financed by the same type of so-called universal banks, Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, HSBC, Royal Bank of Scotland, that were running the same kind of casino banks, mainly where their securities the securities part of the bank was dominating everything else.
I've seen figures that the housing market in the United States was approximately 4.6 trillion, and I believe through the derivatives of all of the shell games, through the assembly line of everything that creates this carnage underneath the approved stamps of
with
underwriting
the CDOs and the credit default swaps that supported the CDOs, right.
that go
So
to $800 trillion. I mean, it was truly a global catastrophe. But then,
right.
but
Well,
then,
you had a multiple series of bets, on top. I mean, if you have time for an anecdote, there's an interesting anecdote. One of my former students had worked as a broker selling condo conversions in Florida in 2004 and 5, where they were converting apartment buildings into condos, and they were subprime loans. And he said that was bad. He said, in fact, he bought one of those loans and ended up losing his condo. But then he was hired. He was more of a tech guy, so then he was hired by an outfit that was selling condos in Spain. The difference, he said, was in Florida, we were actually selling physical stuff. There were actually physical apartment buildings that were kind of run down that were going to be converted into condos, but there was something there. He said in the Costa del Sol in Spain, they were selling condos. They hadn't even broken ground. They didn't even have good title to the property. They were selling pieces of air to all these people in Ireland, Britain, Germany, whatever. And they never broke ground on any of the projects. So in some ways, Europe was, maybe even more insane than the United States, but which is one reason that Europe suffered even a worse financial and economic collapse than we did.
well, and it reminds me of what China went through just the last 5 years, because
they're repeating the same thing, right?
Yeah. So we're looking at this scenario, but now it comes the big eureka, because we started with what was Glass-Steagall, where did it come from, how did it manifest, and what was it supposed to do? And the continuum is that deceptive acts and practices became illegal. You separate commercial banking from investment banking, so you lose the incentive to gamble with other people's money. And we ended up with 70 years, roughly 50 to 70 years.
And you have a stable banking system then, right?
So we created deregulation, which led to this situation. But see, you've created in your work what I read that I found, like everything else, the details. And I mean, we're talking about, and you'll see in the description, the link to taming the mega banks and other things. As I said in the introduction, I mean, and I've been in your office. I've seen your office. You have towers and towers.
I finally had to clean it out when I retired. Right.
Oh my goodness. Well,
that was about a 5-day job, right?
I'll never forget. That's really cool to hear you say that, because I'll never forget the level of just, it was so overwhelming to think that you could, and then you look at your work and your citations and the professionalism, and you understand what it means to be a professor emeritus at a great prestigious university and all the things you came from to be on the FCIC. But here we are giving you this information, my friends, that we're listening to things as ridiculous and pedestrian every single night on network television about 91 indictments and these things that are horrific. But we're talking about monumental global theft that leads to a doom loop that ultimately requires something to
a series of never-ending bailouts. They keep getting bigger. So what you have in 2008 is a repeat of again 1933, a destabilized banking system, securities markets in free fall because they had sold these worthless securities to literally millions of people. And as you say, then the actual collateral for the loans is crushed. So the homes are gone. Many commercial properties are gone. Many companies are going bankrupt because they can't pay all the loans that they took on that they shouldn't have taken on, and the lenders knew that they should never have made, but again thought that they could pass the hot potato by securitizing these loans, packaging them up and selling the securities to other people. But inevitably, the most risky stuff, which they couldn't sell, the banks kept on their own balance sheets or were exposed to in different ways. So ultimately, as you say, everything comes home to roost when the market comes unstuck.
Except for there's no accountability for those who are working on fees that were.
Yes. So, right, what didn't happen in 2008 was, as you say, there was no real accountability for the insiders. Okay, some of them lost their jobs, but most of them walked away with enormous payouts, which were not clawed back. as very rich people, even if they were then in retirement. But there was no real accountability. Not a single criminal case was brought against any of the top chieftains of any of the so-called Big 17, which were the major firms that drove the boom and drove the crash. Not a single indictment of any of the top people.
And we had guys like Jamie Dimon meeting with Eric Holder on numerous occasions. I think it's
yeah. And Eric Holder said, not only are these banks too big to fail, but they're too big to prosecute. And he said, Eric Holder said, and this is a pretty close quote, that the decision-making authority within these giant, institutions, which exceed, $1 trillion in many cases, is so complex and so diffuse and so hard to trace that you can't figure out who was responsible, right? That everybody says it wasn't me, I didn't do it, so we can't figure out who actually made the decisions. Now that I think is crazy, because if you actually did a proper forensic analysis, you can find out exactly, who made the decisions or who
if
authorized them.
Pecora could achieve what he did without technology and without the resources, you and your brethren, your colleagues, could have figured out this and then some, and you did, because I've read it in the federal.
The FCIC report is a very good report. The problem is, that you had a divided commission, and the 3 Republican members were determined not to let the majority, go to the full extent that it might have. And you didn't. My mistake. I think they made a mistake by not appointing a single prosecutor as questioner. In other words, it looked more like a congressional committee where each member would have so many minutes to interrogate a witness. But that kind of sequential questioning is never as effective as having one prosecutor who basically can go after a witness and not let them hide, not let them evade, just keep pinning them down until finally they either perjure themselves or they, take the Fifth Amendment or they admit what they've done. Since you didn't have a single prosecuting attorney, leading the questioning and basically dominating the questioning, to me, the FCIC, although it produced a wonderful report and a lot of good information, was not as devastating as Pecora, because the Senate committee on which he served basically turned over most of the questioning to him. The members would do follow-up questioning, but they basically gave him free rein to question as much as he wanted.
But meanwhile, the press didn't cover it, Art. I remember being in the
that was also true.
This is why we had to make the con. This is why I continued to pull the threads. But what it led me to understand and miraculously find people like you to provide this incredible wealth of information that the mainstream media refused to do, and we have in our work at www.thecon.tv and further information. But what we've got to get to now in this conversation, which is the most important aspect of it, was that I hate to call the FCIC a dog and pony show, because that's not fair, because it was great. But in the end, what I understood, because I did talk to, I'm thinking about Phil Angelides and others, they meant for this to be this was the beginning, right? And then DOJ was doing this, but people might be asking themselves, well, wait a second, if there was all this evidence and Congress could have done it and they didn't, but we had this investigation, and then all of a sudden there were all of these fines. What I found later downstream was, look, the DOJ revealed that the whole thing was a fraud. But then you have these deferred prosecutions, and then you have these PR, $209 billion of fines to the mega banks. But then what we have most importantly, and this is where your work in the doom loop and everything that we need to cover after 2020, because we're up to 2008-9, is the fact that the Federal Reserve put in play extraordinary emergency lending scenarios to prop up the financial system, of which the managers of this literally got away with everything we're talking about. Can you pick up there?
Yeah, so the magnitude of the bailouts, in 2008 and 9 was just stunning. I mean, you have essentially $290 billion of TARP taxpayer money, going into the largest banks. Citigroup and Bank of America alone received $90 billion of that money. You have the FDIC guaranteeing another I can't remember the precise number, but exceeding $200 billion of debt issued by these companies at very generous rates. And then, as you say, you have the Federal Reserve opening the spigots on emergency lending to the tune of, if you added all the loans, in a sense, as sequentially as independent transactions, the total amount of loans was 19 trillion. If you take them at a peak value, the total value was around 6 or 8 trillion. But most of these loans went to the largest institutions. So I think about 16 trillion of that 19 trillion number, went to the 14 biggest U.S. European banks and securities firms that were converted into banks. So you had Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs being converted into banks. You have Merrill Lynch
being they could get access to the funds of the bank holding window.
They can get full access to the Fed and full access to TARP. Then you get Merrill Lynch getting picked up by Bank of America. Bear Stearns getting picked up by J.P. Morgan. So the only big institution that is allowed to fail is Lehman Brothers. And after Lehman, they basically said nobody else. In February of 2009, all of the federal officials got together and made a public announcement that the 19 largest U.S. banks, everybody over 100 billion, would not be allowed to fail. They would be given whatever was needed to allow them to survive. That obviously created a too big to fail club. Anybody over 100 billion, they were given absolute carte blanche, and so you have a complete bailout of all the large institutions. The same thing happened in Europe, essentially.
How does that sit well with a Republican such as yourself by way of moral hazard?
Yeah, well, this is the problem. I mean, if you believe in market discipline, there has to be accountability, and I understand that you can't allow large institutions, giant institutions, to fail in the middle of a crisis. But that should lead you to conclude that, okay, we probably shouldn't have such giant institutions. They're too dangerous not just to fail, but to exist. And secondly, you certainly should have accountability for the leaders of these institutions, who got their institutions into a place where they either would be bailed out or fail. They have to be held accountable. So if you don't have meaningful market discipline during good times, and if you don't have meaningful accountability for insiders, then you no longer have a market. What we now have is crony capitalism. It's not really capitalism. It's crony capitalism, where the too big to fail crowd know that they won't be allowed to fail. They know that there's probably little or no accountability for their insiders. So why shouldn't they take excessive risks during good times, right? Because the feeling is you have an asymmetric risk curve. You can shoot the moon on the upside, and you have a floor underneath you on the downside, which is the Fed and the Treasury. And so what we've seen is a continued cycle of excessive risk taking, unstable booms, and then as soon as there's any trouble at all, the government rushes in to stabilize the market, which just further entrenches the too big to fail problem, as you say, with all the moral hazard that goes with it. Because moral hazard is basically saying taking risks that you would not take if you didn't have insurance against those risks. So the too big to fail policy, and in a sense, the too big to prosecute policy, is an insurance policy that you can take all the risks you want, and you can take all the upside you want, and you're not going to be allowed to fail, and probably there's going to be little or no accountability for your insiders. So that's moral hazard on steroids. Just today, in today's Wall Street Journal, there's an article about regional banks and the problems that they're experiencing, which we can connect to the 2023 banking crisis.
Before we do that,
let me just make this one quote. So Bill Demchak, who was a former J.P. Morgan Chase banker who now leads PNC, which is one of the largest regional bank. So Demchak said that the problems that regional banks are experiencing in the 2023 crisis mean that you have to get to scale. You have to get to size. And why, he says, because if you're big enough, you then have quasi support or quasi support. What does that mean? You have too big to fail treatment. So Demchak and his peers know, let's get ourselves to the point where we're incontestably too big to fail, just like JP Morgan Chase or just like Bank of America. Then we're home free, right?
Absolutely. I'm reminded of what Bill taught me based on Gresham's dynamic. When bad ethics drives good ethics out of the marketplace,
Yes.
even all of the other elements that we've talked about. But I want to bridge this back to to the next phase of this, because people are so lost in the weeds because everybody on the baseline claims that the whole system is rigged and it's corrupt.
Yeah. Right.
Nobody knows who did what, when, and how. And millions of people are putting their support behind a guy who's indicted 91 times, who's up to his eyeballs in the civil fraud trial with many of the same things we're talking about. But when we're talking about 2008 and 9 and the emergency scenario and what Professor Wilmart has mentioned as really a distortion of the markets, and it's actually an abomination of the markets.
Right. That's why it's crony capitalism at its worst. Right. Right.
But when I continue to think about it, and I'm aware of 98 emergency meetings behind closed doors in this time period between Hank Paulson and Tim Geithner and Bernanke, and they all have roles in this whole thing, but yet they're going to clean it up. And I remember,
and there's even a report that Paulson went to Moscow to meet with the Goldman Sachs board just before Lehman weekend. So just before. What did he tell them at that meeting? That's never been, to my knowledge, it's never been disclosed.
That one really gives another sort of scenario with ponder the idea of the bazooka. But meanwhile, we ended up with trillions of dollars of emergency lending and all of these extraordinary things. But what it ushers in, because what people get confused about, Professor Wilmart, and I wonder if you can shed some more light, because we've got to get to this notion when we're talking about a new Glass-Steagall Act, is the threat. Right. Because our entire economy should and has blossomed under previous eras of honesty, of incredible innovation, of incredible work ethic, incredible verticals, and things that we kind of take as, I don't know, maybe just we all think of ourselves this way as Americans. But
so we've morphed into a debt-driven economy and a boom and bust economy that is based upon endless speculation. This asymmetric risk curve I mentioned, where there's a belief in unlimited upside for the big financial giants, the big financial conglomerates, and a floor, which some people call the Fed put. That you can put you can put your bad stuff to the Fed when things get bad. So let's look at what's happened. So between 2009 and 2020. You had a fairly slow and not very impressive recovery, but with massive amounts of private and public debt being created during that period.
Comment on quantitative easing in that capacity.
Quantitative easing was a big part of it, because the Fed steps in and is buying up huge amounts of government securities, which helps fund the government debt, buying up huge amounts of mortgage-backed securities, which helps stabilize the housing market and keeping interest rates down. But because interest rates are so low, you have people then investing in all sorts of new types of speculative investments, whether it's, again, highly leveraged corporate loans, crypto, products, things that seem to be, paying a higher return than normal investments. So if you hold interest rates artificially too low for too long, you encourage all this debt taking and speculation. So look who prospers most during this period: private equity firms. So private equity firms are engaging in massive leveraged buyouts of just about everything, taking on enormous amounts of debt. All of that debt depends upon the idea that at some point they'll be able to sell these companies back to the public market. So private equity, creates this illusion we don't need public markets anymore, right? We're doing so much better privately, but they can't make a return and can't make their money unless ultimately they sell these companies back to the public through IPOs or through some kind of merger and acquisition with a public company. So the private equity firms are building up massive leverage in all sectors of the economy. So what happens in 2020 when the pandemic comes and basically the economy is shut down? Of course, now you have total panic in the financial markets, and you have total panic in the corporate debt market. We've been told that the banks are so much stronger and more resilient now that they can stand on their own. They didn't stand for one day. The market shut down, I think it was March 17th or 18th. The Treasury bond market shut down. All the money market funds shut down. The commercial paper market shut down. The big guys just stepped back and said, we're not doing anything. And the Fed had to step in and recreate essentially all of the big emergency lending programs that they did in 2008 and 9. They had to prop up the commercial paper market, prop up the money market funds, prop up the repo markets. And then they went much further because they basically essentially guaranteed the corporate debt market as well, the corporate bond market. But at first they said, we're only going to buy investment grade bonds if we need to. The private equity firms went to them and said, if you do that, we're going to all collapse, because a lot of our companies now have non-investment grade, so-called fallen angel bonds that are not investment grade. They'll be crushed. And so the Fed basically expanded their corporate bond buying program to include bonds that were once investment grade but had fallen into non-investment grade territory. So that basically liquefied and supported all the private equity firms. So so again, we avert a crisis, a full-blown crisis, but only at the cost of bailing out everybody, all the big financial firms, the entire wholesale debt market, the entire corporate bond market. The private equity firms, we bailed out everybody.
Airlines, casinos.
Airlines, right, same thing. Right.
Carnival cruises.
Yeah, cruise companies, right. So, what you have is then that when you get to 2022, by this time, the total federal debt has gone to about $32 trillion. It was $9 trillion in 2007. So we have more than tripled the federal debt in about 14 or 15 years. Now it's 34 trillion. If you look at private sector debt, it's comparable. I mean, the debt levels are at unprecedented, unseen levels. So how is this sustainable? That every time the crises keep getting bigger, and the bailouts keep getting bigger, right? And the debt loads keep getting bigger.
All going to the smallest group of people that manage it all.
Right. And the wealth is right funneling up to the not certainly the 1%, but particularly the top 1/10 of 1%, right? Absolutely. And the corporate CEOs and the private equity chieftains.
Billionaires doubled their wealth during this time.
Jamie Dimon is now worth, somewhere nearing $2 billion, all from his stock options, right? The private equity chieftains are worth multiple billions at this point. So to me, this is a completely unsustainable path that eventually people will not want to buy treasury bills anymore. There will not be any credibility in the Fed. The Fed is now suffering massive losses on all the bonds they bought during the low interest period, because now they're all depreciated in value. So at what point is Congress going to have to bail out the Fed if this keeps going on?
Wow, that's interesting. That would come from the Treasury.
Right. So now we have what I call the global doom loop, which is endless increases in debt and risk taking by the private financial sector because of we've essentially bankified our financial system. We've combined banks with the rest of our financial system. So we can't allow the financial system to collapse, because that would collapse our banking system, because they know that everybody's going to take more and more risk. The Fed put is on steroids, where the Fed will step in and stabilize whenever there's a problem. And so this boom and bust cycle will continue until at some point the banks become not just too big to fail, but too big to save. Now, that almost happened in Europe in 2012, and they barely survived it. But at what point do our financial giants, our bankified financial conglomerates, at what point do they become too big to save? People say it would never happen. Well, it has happened in the past. It could happen to us.
Well, in the 2023, I was going to say in the further sequel, you take it forward through this doom loop, but then you go into, because of all of this, I've heard it referred.
Right.
It's just phony money basically to all of these players. But then
So crypto is the latest iteration.
yes,
So crypto is based upon nothing, right? If you buy crypto tokens like Bitcoin, it has no inherent value. They compare it to gold, but it's not like gold. Gold has some inherent value. It has some uses for things other than just a store of value, but it has some inherent value. Bitcoin has no inherent value. There's nothing there. These are greater fool theory coins. There's a greater fool out there that will buy it from you at a higher price than you paid, which is in a sense like the house flipping, going back in 2006 and 7, right? Somebody will pay more for this house than I paid, even though I paid far too much for it, right? But I can flip it to somebody else. Well, eventually nobody wants that house, right? And then you're stuck. The last person holding the hot potato is stuck. So Bitcoin and the other crypto tokens are no different, but people are making money, right, promoting them. I mean, Sam Bankman-Fried is right, the classic example, or Mr. Changpeng Zhao from Binance, another example. They're just promoting worthless stuff and collecting a lot of money in the process. And as long as people are willing to pay, unlike Sam Bankman-Fried, you don't go into too many speculative ventures yourself that fail. You can keep this game going. And now big tech is entering, right? Big tech is saying, "Hey, let's us get into the banking system, because if we can become banks,
right?
then we would be."
Can I interrupt you for 1 second to ask this pertinent question, because I want to finish with the fintech, but
Right.
But what you just touched upon is so extraordinary for so many reasons, right? Because as we've discussed throughout this now hour and 9 minutes, the nature of the problem not being fixed because we didn't create a new Glass-Steagall Act.
Right. We didn't split banks from the securities market, so the banks cannot be promoting speculative financial products and
Which is also the
them.
capital markets and what you're talking about. And that's another, I mean, we can just, but I want to just, nail this point really quick, because the speculation was, further devised by this nonstop emergency stimulus from the Federal Reserve into these markets, lead to these things. Now, anybody who knows the background on crypto, you realize there's this, this myth of this guy, what is it, Satoshi Nakamoto, back in right about 2007, to create alternatives to the.
And they were actually arguing that Bitcoin or these other crypto tokens would be more reliable than the financial system that no one believed in anymore. Of course, what we're finding is they're just like the financial system.
Exactly. But this is the point.
It's interesting that because our governments had destroyed everybody's trust in the financial system, it gave an opening for these guys.
But there's one place though, and this is what's so devastatingly ironic about this whole thing, but the only value that blockchain and Bitcoin and all of these other things are providing at the moment is major capital flows from, let's just call it, crime syndicates.
Yes, because the other thing about crypto is it's hard to trace.
Right.
Because it's hard to trace and it's not subject yet to effective anti-money laundering, effective terrorist sanction enforcement, effective tax compliance, people can engage in these secretive financial transactions using crypto to avoid taxes, to avoid terrorist sanctions, to avoid
and they prop up politicians too, like Robert F. Kennedy.
And no wonder that Hamas turns out to be a major user of crypto, right?
Of course. And so that last point, and then I'm just going to be quiet, but it's just such a remarkably important point, because all of this stuff is just imbued organized crime on a monumental level that is basically holding the world hostage, but particularly the American middle class, because of the law, but because of the revolving door of politicians. Think about what Sam Bankman-Fried did with the $70 million to the Dems and the $50 million to the Republicans. And as we move forward to there, and I know you're going to get into fintech, can you marry that? Because at the top of fintech is you've got guys like Elon Musk who've been there from the beginning. So I want to be quiet.
So, the big tech firms, they understand that if they can get into the banking system, mainly through payments, and they're obviously experimenting with stable coins, which are effectively fake deposits. Excuse me. They're experimenting with these stable coins that purport to be deposits backed up by some type of reserves that nobody knows quite what they are, but these are as good as deposits. And so take our stable coins and then you can make payment using our stable coins. And, PayPal is pushing this now. The big tech would like to get into it. Facebook tried and failed, but they're going to come back. I'm sure Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, they're all looking at it. So if they could get into the payment system and become like banks, first of all, then they become the too big to fail crowd, right? And they have even more protection than they already have. Secondly, they now have access to everything, every bit of information about you.
Right.
Because they already know about all your purchasing and shopping patterns, right? And buying patterns. Now they would have access to every payment that you make. They would know everything about you. And presumably it wouldn't be long until they get all the healthcare information they want about you. But so they would be, talk about, surveillance, they would have total information about everybody. So this, do we really want a corporate surveillance state? I mean, in many ways, this would be, in my view, even more threatening than the too big to fail financial firms that at least yet don't have total information about you the way that big tech would have. So we've got to keep big tech out of banking. There's been Glass-Steagall was one policy, which is separate banks from the securities firms. There was also a long established policy called separating banking from commerce, which is people engaged in commercial transactions shouldn't be banks, and banks shouldn't be engaged in commercial transactions because you want banks to be objective lenders, right? To make loans based upon objective criteria, not because they want you to do business with Facebook versus Apple, versus AT&T, let's say. But as soon as you allow AT&T or Apple or Facebook or anybody to own a bank or to run a bank, obviously they're only going to make loans to people, or they're going to reward people for buying stuff from their companies and punish them for not. And you can see that in China. So in China, you had these two companies, Ant Financial Group, which was spun off from Alibaba, and Tencent, which had something called WePay. These were the two dominant big tech firms in China, and they basically said, if you want to do business with us, you only do business with our group of companies, not with anybody else. You'll get punished if you do business with other people. Now, interesting, I'm no fan of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government, but they stepped in and broke up these companies because they saw that they were getting so much control and power. I worry that, imagine if big tech firms got into banking here, imagine the power they would have and the ability to leverage that power to force you to either, patronize the companies they want you to patronize, and you're going to be punished if you try to go to a competitor, let alone that they know everything about you and they can use that information however they want.
It occurred to me just now, and it never occurred to me before. And the two things that are going to stand out with this interview for me on personal reasons, but I got to segue this. The first thing I'm going to say out loud is Kuhn Loeb, because I've got a kind of a connection to that.
But, right.
But the other side of the, but look, it just occurred to me. Okay,
see, JP Morgan was the WASP securities firm, leading firm, and Kuhn Loeb was the leading Jewish securities firm in New York back in the 1920s, when clearly you were one or the other, essentially.
Right. So
that's another story, right?
Right. But okay. I learned a long time ago from Donald Trump, the methodology is lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate. Now,
right.
You consider that, okay, it's kind of a formula. And you look at what Elon Musk has done with X as a platform. And he also has Venmo and PayPal and all of these other things, which got him into becoming what he ultimately did.
Yes, right.
Not to mention his relationship with the government and so forth. But this,
and he said that he wants X to get into payments. I mean, that's one of his goals.
Yeah. The scheme right now that is the sort of paranoia on the right, and I share it to a degree, is the idea of central bank digital currency, but they're using it as
because they could track everything. They could track everything.
But fintech already is. And
yes,
so it's kind of like
that's the way that why we have to keep big tech out of banking, because otherwise you're going to have corporate surveillance state instead of a government surveillance state, right?
Wait, so let me just remind the viewers out there and everybody that I've got to get this message through to. When you consider a billionaire like Elon Musk, who doubled his net worth during a time of COVID because of all the things that the doom loop produces that Mr. Wilmarth has introduced to us, to go to the richest guy in the world to what? Finance what's now become a platform of propaganda, but it's also to maneuver all of these paranoias with everything they're doing with digital bank, currency, but they already have your information. And he's already been a beneficiary of all this. So the question is,
artificial intelligence is another story, but I mean, these guys are pushing AI, and I can assure you that they're not pushing it for the advantage of the common person, right? That we could get into another discussion about what they think AI will actually do, but it's not good. It should be a great alarm to everybody. And so again, are you going to allow these big tech firms who are pushing AI to get control of the part of the financial system, and again, to have complete control over everything that you do in your daily life? I mean, I think it, if I had one message to go out is, reinstate Glass-Steagall, which is separate banks from the financial markets, the securities markets, so we stop bankifying our entire financial system and essentially holding government hostage to supporting the financial system against any possible problems, because then effectively you're privatizing the gain and socializing the risk, right? But the second message would be, we've got to strengthen and solidify the separation of banking and commerce, so that banking firms are not engaged in commercial activities, and commercial firms like big tech firms cannot control banking. I mean, these are prudent separations, right? And the idea that you put everything into one basket, right? So Mark Twain supposedly said you can put all your eggs into one basket, but you better watch that basket. What that really means is, if you put everything into one basket, first of all, the basket becomes incredibly controlling, right? It controls everything. But secondly, you can't allow the basket to be jostled, even touched. And so now the government becomes completely hostage to making sure the basket never falls and the eggs never break. But the eggs know that, right? And they therefore run the government and run the show. So these are two simple things: reinstate Glass-Steagall, strengthen the separation of banking and commerce. Then we might have something that looks like a fair and honest economy and a fair and honest set of financial markets that work for us instead of working for the oligarchs, effectively.
Is Citizens United the sort of companion piece to that?
I'm sorry?
Is Citizens United a companion piece to that?
Yes, because I mean, essentially, then if there are no limits on political contributions from corporations, and ultimately there's no limit on who controls the media, then obviously the largest and most powerful financial and corporate groups will control the politics and will control the media. As you say, crypto should have been completely delegitimized by now. There's been scandal after scandal, collapse after collapse, fraud after fraud. The only reason that they're still even in the mix, in the play, is that they have given so much money to politicians, so much money to law firms and consulting firms and other enablers, so much money to media, that they can keep spreading this false propaganda and lies about how great crypto will be and how wonderful it will be, even though everybody knows that up until now it's been nothing but a fraud and a scam, and as you point out, a cover for criminal enterprise. So you couldn't explain that if you didn't have, as you say, unlimited political contributions from corporations and unlimited control of media by corporations.
Wow. Well, Professor Wilmart, we're at 1 hour and 21 minutes. I will say thank you for your, once again, it's such an honor to speak with you, but you in plain speak, I think, laid out the situation. I just have to encourage everybody that's watching this to please read Taming the Megabanks. The link will be in the description, but more importantly, we have to organize. We have to raise the information. We have to we have to animate a movement against.
You have to engage the falsehoods and rebut them and try to present as you say, the actual facts. I mean, that storytelling is very valuable as long as you're telling the true story, right? But you have to also combat the false stories that are out there, the distortions and the twisting of truth.
Could any of this happen without the way technology is today, do you think?
I mean, the fact that it happened during the 1920s, the fact that it happened during the 1920s is at least a cautionary tale. But there are people who will say that the Roaring '20s, the boom of the false boom of the '20s, would not have happened without the rapid spread of newspapers and the advent of radio. I mean, there were panics and booms before that, certainly, but the ability to reach mass audiences is obviously key in terms of if you're going to try to create really large scale financial frauds. You have to go after the ordinary people and you have to be able to reach them. So it was the newspapers and radios and telephones in the 1920s. As you say, now it's even more overwhelming and instantaneous. The only positive I see is that it's harder, let's say, going back to the days where we had three television networks, and if you didn't hear it on the three television networks, it really wasn't a story. At least now we have many more alternative venues where people can try to get the truth out. Again, it takes a lot of effort and working together, so people are not just working, individually. But at least I think it's harder for even big tech and big corporations to completely suppress the truth. But there's a lot of work to be done.
I'm going to close with that because the idea and what I continue to learn with all of these things is exactly. Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes, but technology enables two things right now. We've got a capacity to make things more transparent, but yet the system can hide it more readily. But the difference is those that actually are in the positions of power to regulate the situation for a country of, by, and for the people, for free markets, for a democracy, and the ability for the American dream to thrive. And I'll finish off on that note. Professor Wilmart, again, as always, thank you so much. And I look forward to hopefully bringing more and more attention to your scholarly work, but we've got to have somebody like you ultimately in a position to address Congress, I would think, what you already have, but with with millions of people with the facts. But anyway, hopefully we'll be able to do that.
No, happy to continue the conversation. Right. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Patrick.
All the best. Take care.
You too. Thanks.